There is a question that has never been fully answered to anyone's satisfaction, not by the generals who lived it, not by the historians who have spent half a century arguing about it, and not by the politicians who have tried, periodically, to extract some usable lesson from the wreckage. The question is this: how does a country lose a war it was never supposed to be able to lose? Not a close war, not a war where the outcome was genuinely uncertain from the beginning, but a war in which one side had the most sophisticated military technology ever assembled, virtually unlimited industrial capacity, and the full weight of the world's wealthiest nation behind every decision it made. And the other side had tunnels and time and a particular quality of patience that turns out, when you follow the story all the way through, to be the most decisive military asset of the 20th century. Before we go any further, if this kind of story is what you come here for, subscribing to the channel means the next one will find you when it is ready. There is no better company than history at this hour. Now, let us begin. It is the hour before dawn in the Delta, and the air sits on the skin like something damp and warm that has no intention of lifting. The water in the paddies is perfectly still, holding the last of the darkness in its surface, and somewhere in the distance, in the tree line that runs along the far edge of the field, something moves or seems to move and then does not move again. The smell of wood smoke and wet earth, and something older, something that has been in this soil for centuries, comes across the open ground and settles. There are no sounds yet that belong to the war. The war is still a few hours away, or a few years, depending on which morning you choose to stand in. In this particular darkness, before the birds begin and before the light finds the tops of the palms, the Delta is simply itself, which is to say, it is one of the oldest inhabited landscapes on Earth. A place that has been farmed and flooded and farmed again for 3,000 years. A place that knows very well how to wait. The land has been here longer than the names that armies have given it. It will be here when the last of those names has faded. This is where the story lives. Not in the newspapers, or the strategy documents, or the congressional hearings, though all of those matter. But here, in the specific air of a specific country whose geography shaped everything that happened to it and made certain outcomes, however unlikely they seemed on paper, almost inevitable. The question of how a small, poor nation defeats a superpower is, in the end, a question about land and about belonging, about what it means to have nowhere else to go and therefore no reason to stop. Close your eyes for a moment and stand in it. The air is warm and thick, and it smells of the Delta, of water and earth and the particular green that comes off rice paddies in the hour before the sun arrives. Somewhere behind you, further down the path, a dog is going about its business in the dark. The light is beginning, just barely, to change in the east, a smudging of the horizon that has not yet committed to anything, and the birds are beginning to feel it. One or two calls from the tree line, tentative and brief, before the silence comes back. This is the country. This is where you are. Stay here a little longer before the history begins. Vietnam is a country shaped like a question mark, or like a long scar running down the eastern edge of the Indochinese peninsula, narrow and coastal and green, its southern and northern ends each anchored by a great river delta and its middle connected by a thin corridor of mountains and coast. The geography matters more than it might seem. Those two deltas, the Red River in the north and the Mekong in the south, are among the most productive agricultural landscapes in the world, capable of feeding populations many times larger than the land itself suggests. The mountains that run along the western border, folding into Laos and Cambodia, are dense enough to hide an army. The coast is long and the coastline complex. The whole country is, from a military standpoint, extraordinarily difficult to occupy permanently, because it is too long and too varied to control from any single point, and because its people have been demonstrating that fact to successive invaders for more than 2,000 years. The Chinese arrived first, roughly 2 millennia ago, and they stayed for a very long time, more than 1,000 years in various configurations of domination and partial domination, long enough to leave permanent marks on the language and the culture and the administrative traditions of Vietnam, and also long enough to produce in the Vietnamese people a deep and durable instinct for resistance that has operated at a level below conscious political calculation, something closer to a reflex than a strategy. Every generation of Vietnamese history contains a story of someone who fought the Chinese and either succeeded partially or failed entirely, but succeeded eventually. The resistance accumulating across centuries into something that functions less like a military tradition and more like a cultural absolute. The understanding that this is what the people of this place do when occupied, that they wait, and they resist and they endure and eventually they prevail. That pattern, established over 1,000 years of Chinese domination and intermittent freedom, is the context without which the 20th century makes no sense. When the French arrived in the 19th century, they arrived into a country that had been practicing resistance for longer than France had been a nation. They did not know this, or they did not think it mattered, which amounts to the same thing. The French came for rubber and rice and tin and the commercial advantages of a colonial holding on the eastern edge of Asia, and they imposed their presence with the particular comprehensive thoroughness of a colonial power in the high imperial period, when the belief that European civilization was not only superior, but actively beneficial to the peoples it subdued, was not an eccentricity but a consensus. The taxation was systematic. The forced labor was systematic. The extraction of resources from the land and the people who farmed it was systematic, calibrated by administrators in Hanoi and Paris, who measured their success in export tonnage and trade balances, and did not include in their calculations anything that happened to the men and women who produced those numbers. It is worth sitting for a moment with what colonial rule actually meant at the level of a single family in a single village in the Red River Delta in the early 20th century. It meant a tax burden that required selling a portion of whatever the family grew before the family ate, a burden that in bad harvest years meant hunger and in very bad years meant worse. It meant that the men of the village could be conscripted for labor on French construction projects, roads and railways and plantations. Labor that was not exactly slavery, but that bore a close enough resemblance that the distinction was largely semantic from the perspective of the person doing it. It meant that the traditional structures of Vietnamese village life, the community councils, the local customs, the particular relationship between a farming community and the land it had farmed for generations, were subordinated to a French administrative hierarchy that regarded those structures as primitive and inefficient and in need of correction. The French believed sincerely that they were improving Vietnam. The Vietnamese, from the perspective of the village, experienced something that felt considerably less like improvement. Into this world, in the province of Indochina in central Vietnam in 1890, a child was born who would eventually go by so many names that the multiplicity itself became a kind of political statement. His father was a Confucian scholar who had refused to collaborate with the French administration, a small act of principled defiance that cost him his civil service position and defined the household the boy grew up in as one in which the French presence was understood to be an imposition and not a fact of nature. The boy was educated well in the classical Vietnamese tradition and then in French colonial schools, and he was evidently exceptional, the kind of student who absorbs everything and draws his own conclusions from it. He left Vietnam in 1911 as a ship's cook and spent the following decades moving through the world, working in London and Paris and New York, learning the languages and the politics of every place he passed through, becoming, by the time he arrived at the political conclusions that would define his life, one of the most well-traveled and intellectually cosmopolitan revolutionaries of the 20th century. The moment that crystallized his politics is specific enough that it has the quality of a scene from a novel, except that it happened. It was 1919, and the Versailles Peace Conference was underway, the gathering that was supposed to remake the world after the catastrophe of the First World War, on the basis of a principle that the American President Woodrow Wilson had articulated with unusual clarity: national self-determination, the right of peoples to govern themselves. He arrived at Versailles in a rented suit, carrying a petition he had drafted calling for the application of Wilson's principle to Vietnam, for basic political rights for the Vietnamese people, for representation, for the elementary acknowledgements of human dignity that the colonial system denied. He was polite. He was organized. He waited to be received him. The principle of self-determination, it turned out, applied to European peoples reorganizing themselves after a European war. It did not apply to Asians seeking relief from European colonialism. He drew his conclusions, joined the communists, or at least arguing that colonialism was wrong in principle and not merely in practice, and spent the next 25 years building the organization that would make the French position in Vietnam untenable. His name, by the time history found him, was Ho Chi Minh, a name that translates into something close to "he who enlightens," a name he adopted sometime in the 1940s from among the dozens of aliases he had used across decades of underground work. He was small and thin and spoke in a voice that witnesses consistently describe as quiet and warm, the voice of a teacher rather than a general, though he proved capable of directing military operations of extraordinary effectiveness when the moment required it. He was also, by any serious assessment, a genuine communist who believed in the ideology and its framework, and who maintained, throughout his long career, a quality of personal simplicity that made it difficult to accuse him of the kind of self-enrichment that characterized so many of the leaders produced by the anti-colonial movements of the 20th century. He lived modestly. He wore simple clothes. He tended a garden. He was also responsible, directly and indirectly, for an enormous amount of death, as all revolutionary leaders of his era were, and the accounting of his legacy is genuinely complicated. But for the purposes of the story we are following tonight, what matters most is that he was, from 1919 onward, the most important single person in Vietnamese politics, the organizing intelligence around which the resistance to French and then American power accumulated, the man who never gave up and who never stopped believing that the thing he was working toward was not only right but inevitable. Yes. He spent the 1920s and 1930s moving between Moscow and Paris and Hong Kong and southern China, building the Indochinese Communist Party, which he founded in 1930, and maintaining the network of contacts and operatives that would eventually become the Viet Minh, the coalition movement that would fight both the Japanese occupation during the Second World War and the French reassertion of colonial authority afterward. The Japanese arrived in 1940, occupying Indochina, but leaving the French colonial administration nominally in place, a situation of layered subordination that was humiliating to the French and clarifying to the Vietnamese nationalists who watched it unfold. If the French could be subordinated in turn by a greater power, the aura of European invincibility on which French colonial authority partly rested was considerably dimmed. Ho's Viet Minh fought the Japanese through the war years, providing intelligence to the Americans, rescuing downed Allied pilots, developing the military organization and the popular support that would serve them in the next phase. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, the French colonial administration had been swept away, and Vietnam existed, for a brief and extraordinary moment, in a political vacuum. Ho Chi Minh moved into that vacuum with the speed of a man who had been waiting for this moment for 3 decades. On the 2nd of September 1945, in a square in Hanoi, before a crowd of hundreds of thousands, he stood up and read out the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. He opened it with words that his listeners might not have immediately recognized, but that he had chosen with great deliberateness the words that opened the American Declaration of Independence. The claim that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was, of course, the American Declaration of Independence, adapted and applied. It was both a statement of genuine conviction. Ho had read widely in the American democratic tradition and found in it something he respected, and a message to the United States, whose support he hoped to secure and whose own stated principles he was pointing out were entirely consistent with Vietnamese independence. The Americans, absorbed in the post-war settlement and deeply suspicious of communist movements anywhere, did not respond. The French came back instead. The morning in the Delta is still dark. The birds have not yet begun. Whatever is in the tree line has settled again into stillness, and the water in the paddies holds its darkness, patient and flat and very old. This is where the next part of the story begins. In the years just after the war that was supposed to end wars, in the space between what Ho had declared and what the French were determined to reassert. The question the next 20 years will answer is not whether Vietnam will be free, because Ho had already answered that question for himself and for the movement he had spent his life building. The question is how much it will cost and who will pay and in what currency. He had been waiting for this moment for 30 years. That is the first thing to understand about the man standing in the square in Hanoi on the 2nd of September 1945, holding a sheaf of papers in a city that had not been free in living memory, preparing to speak to a crowd of hundreds of thousands of people who had come from across the country to hear what he was about to say. Ho Chi Minh was 55 years old, small and thin, and composed in the way that people are composed when they have already spent everything and have arrived at the thing they spent it for and are now simply present in the moment without anxiety, because the anxiety is behind them. He raised the papers and began to read. The words he chose were not his own, at least not the first ones. He read the opening words of the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The crowd would not have known, most of them, that these were the words Thomas Jefferson had written in Philadelphia in 1776, nearly 2 centuries before, that they were standing in a Vietnamese square listening to the American Declaration of Independence being read to them in their own language. Ho had chosen the words deliberately, with the same careful intelligence he had applied to everything across 30 years of revolutionary work. He was making an argument and an appeal simultaneously, telling the Americans, who had supported his Viet Minh during the war against Japan and who had representatives present in the square that morning, that the country now declaring its independence shared the values they professed to hold, that what was happening here was a completion of the project their own founders had started, not a threat to it. He was also, because he was always thinking at multiple levels, making a philosophical claim that the principle of human equality and the right of self-governance were universal, that they did not stop at the borders of Europe or the North Atlantic, that they applied here, in this square, to these people. On this morning, the crowd cheered. A pause opened in the ceremony, and Ho looked up from the papers and asked simply whether his voice was carrying, whether his fellow citizens could hear him. The question was practical, about whether his voice was carrying to the back of the enormous crowd. but the crowd's response to it, a roar that went beyond the answer to a question and became something closer to an affirmation, a collective, yes, that was also a collective we, captured something about the nature of the moment that no subsequent analysis has quite managed to improve on. He smiled and continued reading. And then Ho continued into the Vietnamese declaration itself, laying out the specific grievances against French colonial rule, the 80 years of exploitation and suppression and deliberate underdevelopment, the way the French had kept the Vietnamese people poor and uneducated as a matter of policy, the way they had taken the rice and the rubber and the coal and given back taxation and forced hour, the way they had maintained their hold through a combination of violence and administrative suffocation that left no legitimate avenue for the expression of Vietnamese political will. The indictment was detailed and specific and had been building in Ho's mind and writing for 3 decades. He delivered it in the flat, measured voice of a man who has been waiting long enough that the moment of vindication does not require performance. The Japanese had surrendered 13 days earlier, on the 19th of August, ending the Second World War and removing the occupying force that had nominally replaced the French colonial administration in 1940. In the days between the Japanese surrender and the Hanoi Declaration, the Viet Minh had moved with extraordinary speed into the political vacuum, organizing committees in cities and towns across the country, establishing a provisional government, arranging the ceremony in Hanoi with a logistical precision that was one of Ho's great operational gifts. He understood that political facts, once established and recognized, acquire a momentum that is difficult to reverse, and he was determined to establish as many facts as possible as quickly as possible before the French, distracted by their own post-war reconstruction, could reassert their claim. The French were not prepared to accept what had happened in Hanoi as a fact. They were prepared to acknowledge it as a problem that needed to be corrected. France had lost an enormous amount during the Second World War, including its pride, and the restoration of the French Empire was understood by the government in Paris as part of the restoration of France itself, a necessary component of returning the country to the status of a great power. The Indochinese territories were the most commercially valuable part of that empire, and the idea of simply allowing them to go was not one that the French political establishment was willing to entertain, not in 1945, not after a war that had already taken so much. Negotiations between the French and the Viet Minh produced a preliminary agreement in 1946 that seemed to offer a path towards some kind of autonomous status for Vietnam within a French union. But the agreement was ambiguous and both sides interpreted it in ways that suited their intentions rather than the text, and by December of 1946, the negotiations had collapsed entirely and the war had begun. It began in Hanoi, with a French ultimatum and a Viet Minh response that was military rather than diplomatic. A series of attacks on French positions in the city that were suppressed within days because the Viet Minh forces were not yet capable of fighting the French in a conventional engagement in an urban setting, and Ho knew it. The Viet Minh withdrew from Hanoi and from the cities generally, retreating into the countryside and the mountains, particularly into the Viet Bac region in the north, a landscape of forested hills and valleys that Ho knew well from years of wartime hiding, and that offered the kind of terrain that guerrilla forces require. Difficult to penetrate, easy to disperse into, impossible to hold permanent, life from outside. From there, across the next 8 years, the war would be fought in the way that the Viet Minh's resources and their enemies' weaknesses made possible, not through pitched battles that the French could win, but through patience and attrition and the slow, inexorable erosion of the French will to continue. The architect of the military strategy was not Ho, who was the political intelligence at the center of everything, but Vo Nguyen Giap, a former history teacher from Quang Binh province who had learned military strategy almost entirely from books and who had, by the time the First Indochina War began, developed a theory of revolutionary warfare that drew on Chinese communist models and on the deep Vietnamese tradition of resistance to larger powers. Giap was not a general in the conventional sense, not a man trained in staff colleges to manage large formations in set-piece battles. He was something stranger, and as it turned out, more effective. A strategic thinker who understood that the goal of a weaker force fighting a stronger one is never to destroy the enemy militarily, but to destroy the enemy's willingness to continue, and that this willingness is political and psychological in nature, and therefore vulnerable to methods that have nothing to do with body counts or territorial control. Giap had studied the long history of Vietnamese resistance to Chinese domination and had drawn from it a set of principles that he applied with remarkable consistency across decades of warfare. The first was that time was always on the side of the people defending their own land, because the defender has no choice but to endure while the attacker always has the option of leaving, and that option, once it becomes available to the attacker's domestic political audience, will eventually be taken. The second was that the support of the rural population was not a peripheral concern, but the central strategic fact that a guerrilla force which loses the support of the villages loses its ability to move and supply and recruit, and that maintaining that support required the kind of political and organizational discipline that Giap imposed on the Viet Minh with an intensity that sometimes verged on harshness. The Viet Minh would fight when they could win small engagements. They would melt away when they could not. They would wait for months or years if waiting served the strategy. They would absorb losses that would have caused any conventional army to reconsider its position, because the calculation was not how many men are lost today, but how many years of this can France endure before the political cost at home becomes too high. The French, for their part, could not quite see the war they were fighting. They kept looking for the decisive engagement, the set-piece battle that would destroy the Viet Minh's capacity to resist, and they kept not finding it because Giap would not give it to them. The French held the cities and the roads and some of the coastline, and the Viet Minh held everything else, which is to say, the countryside, the mountains, the majority of the population, and the time. French officers wrote frustrated reports about an enemy that disappeared whenever it was about to be cornered, about supply lines that were ambushed with maddening regularity, about villages that appeared to support the French administration by day and provided food and shelter to Viet Minh units by night. The difficulty was not military. It was conceptual. The French were prepared to fight a war of positions, and they were fighting a war of ideas, and they did not have enough ideas to win. The French government changed frequently during the war years, and French public opinion about the conflict was always divided and became progressively more hostile as the costs accumulated and the victories remained elusive. The war was expensive in money and in lives, and it produced no visible progress toward the kind of outcome that could be presented to a French public as justifying those costs. The Viet Minh, meanwhile, were growing stronger, receiving increasing material support from the newly communist China after 1949, and developing, through the experience of fighting, the organizational capacity and the tactical sophistication that the early years of the war had lacked. By the early 1950s, the balance had shifted enough that Giap was willing to contemplate offensive operations that the Viet Minh would not have considered 5 years earlier. Let the war rest for a moment here, in the hills above the Red River Delta, in the particular quality of a struggle that has been going on for long enough that both sides have incorporated it into their ordinary life. The French soldiers rotating through their postings and going home and being replaced by other French soldiers. The Viet Minh fighters living in the forest and the villages and never going anywhere except deeper into the country they were fighting for. The extraordinary thing about a guerrilla war is that time passes differently for the two sides. For the occupying force, time is an expense. each year adding to the bill that must eventually be presented to the politicians and the public for the resistance. Time is a resource. Each year adding to the accumulated weight of experience and political support and the simple fact of continued existence, which is itself a form of victory when your enemy expected you to have been defeated long since. The decisive moment came in a valley in the northwest of Vietnam, near the Laotian border in the spring of 1954, and it came because the French commander, a general named Henri Navarre, made a decision based on an assumption that seemed so reasonable at the time that its catastrophic wrongness is still slightly difficult to grasp. The valley was called Dien Bien Phu, and Navarre chose it as the site for a major French fortified position, an entrenched camp strong enough to draw the Viet Minh into the kind of conventional engagement that the French would win, and that would, he believed, force a negotiated settlement on terms acceptable to France. The position was supplied entirely by air, which required that the surrounding area remain accessible to French aircraft. The surrounding area consisted of mountains. Navarre's assumption was that Viet Minh artillery, if they had any worth speaking of, could not be moved into those mountains, and therefore could not threaten the airfield. He was wrong about this in a way that determined the outcome of everything that followed. Viet did have artillery. Soviets supplied howitzers of sufficient caliber to destroy the French positions if they could be brought to bear from the surrounding heights. The problem was getting them there. The mountains were steep and forested, and there were no roads capable of supporting the weight of the guns. Viet solved this problem the same way he solved every logistical problem the war presented him with. He used human beings instead of machines. Teams of Viet Minh soldiers, working in shifts over the course of weeks, dismantled the artillery pieces and carried them up the mountains section by section, using ropes and pulleys and the particular Vietnamese capacity for organized collective effort that the French had consistently underestimated. By the time the battle began in earnest in March of 1954, Viet had 56,000 troops surrounding the French garrison of 16,000. And artillery positioned on the high ground that the French had assumed was inaccessible. The first day of sustained artillery fire destroyed the French airfield and made resupply by anything other than parachute impossible. From that moment, the outcome was determined. The battle lasted 56 days. The French fought with considerable courage and complete futility, the garrison shrinking as casualties mounted and reinforcement became increasingly difficult and then impossible. The perimeter contracting under relentless pressure from Viet Minh ground forces and unceasing artillery fire. The artillery commander at Dien Bien Phu, a colonel named Charles Perroth, had assured his superiors before the battle that the Viet Minh could not bring effective artillery to bear on the position. When it became clear on the first day of fighting that he had been wrong, he retired to his bunker, held a grenade to his chest, and detonated it. The garrison surrendered on the 7th of May 1954. It was the first time in the modern era that a non-European force had defeated a European colonial army in a pitched battle, and its political consequences were immediate and enormous. The Geneva Conference was already underway when Dien Bien Phu fell, representatives of France and the Viet Minh and the interested great powers meeting in Switzerland to negotiate the terms of a settlement. The fall of the garrison destroyed whatever leverage France had brought to the table. The Geneva Accords that resulted divided Vietnam temporarily at the 17th parallel, creating a northern zone under Ho Chi Minh's government and a southern zone under a government that would eventually be backed by the United States. The division was explicitly stated to be temporary, a military regroupment line rather than a political border, and the Accords provided for nationwide elections to be held within 2 years that would reunify the country under whatever government the Vietnamese people chose. The Americans, who had been funding roughly 80% of the French war effort by its final stages, did not sign the Accords, but noted them with something between resignation and calculation. The French were finished in Vietnam. Someone else would have to manage the situation now. Everyone who read the Accords carefully understood what the elections clause meant in practice. Ho Chi Minh was the most popular political figure in Vietnam, his name associated with the independence movement and the defeat of France. His party the only organized political force with a national presence. Any free and fair election across the whole country would produce a unified Vietnam under communist rule. And this was a conclusion that the American government, in the early years of the Cold War, with the domino theory operating as the governing logic of its Asia policy, was not prepared to accept. The elections were never held. The government of South Vietnam, installed and supported by the United States, refused to schedule them. Ho's government in the north protested through diplomatic channels and then prepared for the war that would follow, because the failure to hold the elections was not a surprise and the war was not an accident. It was the next stage of something that had been underway for a very long time. What the Geneva Accords gave, and then what they withheld, is worth sitting with in the quiet of this story. A country that had just expelled one empire at enormous cost, that had fought for 8 years and paid for its victory in a way that is difficult to fully calculate, found itself within 2 years of that victory being prepared for a different kind of occupation. This one accomplished not with soldiers on the ground, but with money and advisors, and the weight of great power interest bearing down, in the small country that had made the mistake of being strategically important. Ho Chi Minh had been waiting for 30 years for Vietnam's independence and had achieved it at Dien Bien Phu, and then watched as the Geneva Conference handed it back, temporarily and conditionally, to the same international system that had been deciding Vietnam's fate since the French arrived. He would wait again. He was very good at waiting, and the next empire, unlike the French, had not yet learned how patient the other side could be. There is a final detail about the declaration ceremony that deserves its moment before the story moves on. Among the American officers present in the square that day was a small group from the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence organization that had worked with the Viet Minh against the Japanese and had developed, through that cooperation, a genuine respect for Ho Chi Minh and his organization. One of those officers, an intelligence operative named Archimedes Patty, stood in the crowd and watched the declaration being read and thought by his own later account that something real and significant was happening, that the man on the stage had genuine popular support and genuine political capacity, and that the United States should engage with him seriously rather than backing the French restoration. Patty wrote reports to this effect. The reports went to Washington. Nothing came of them. The decision had already been made, or was being made, at a level above field intelligence officers in Hanoi squares. France was an ally. France wanted Indochina back, and communism anywhere was the threat that trumped every other consideration. The reports from Hanoi were filed and noted and did not change the policy. The Americans who had been present at the declaration went home. The French came back, and so Vietnam had expelled its first empire at an enormous cost and arrived at what should have been the beginning of its own story, only to find that the space left by the French was already being filled by something else, an American interest in the region that had been building quietly throughout the entire First War, watching from the edges, drawing its own conclusions. We can move forward now, a decade along from Geneva, into the moment when that interest became a presence, and the presence became a commitment, and the commitment became, with a speed that still surprises, the largest military deployment since the Second World War. Because the story of how America entered Vietnam is also the story of how governments tell themselves things that are not quite true until the things become policy. The officer standing at the radar screen in the Gulf of Tonkin on the night of the 4th of August 1964 was doing what officers do in ambiguous situations. He was reporting what he thought he was seeing, and what he thought he was seeing was not entirely clear. The USS Maddox had been operating in the Gulf on an intelligence-gathering mission, and 2 days earlier there had been a genuine attack by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, a real engagement that had caused no casualties and minor damage, provoked in part by American-supported South Vietnamese raids on North Vietnamese coastal installations that the American government had not publicly acknowledged. Though, now in heavy weather on a dark night, the radar was showing contacts, possible torpedo runs, and a crew was firing at targets that may or may not have been there in sea conditions that were later described as capable of producing false radar returns, and in a state of heightened anxiety that made the interpretation of ambiguous data considerably more difficult than it would have been on a calm afternoon. The attack, the second attack, the one that would be cited as justification for the most consequential congressional resolution of the era, may not have happened. President Lyndon Johnson knew within a fairly short time that the evidence for the second attack was at best uncertain, and at worst a product of weather and fear and institutional momentum rather than enemy action. He chose to treat the incident as a definitive provocation anyway, not because he was indifferent to the truth, but because the truth was complicated and the political moment was simple. He had an opportunity to secure congressional authorization for the military action in Vietnam that his advisors had been telling him would eventually be necessary, and the Gulf of Tonkin incident, real or imagined, was the lever. The resolution that Congress passed on the 7th of August 1964 gave the president authority to take whatever military action he deemed necessary in Southeast Asia, without a formal declaration of war, a blank check written in the confusion of a dark night on a radar screen, to be cashed over the following decade in a currency that nobody in that congressional chamber had fully imagined. The senators who voted for the resolution, 88 of them with only 2 dissenting, did so in many cases with genuine uncertainty about what they were authorizing. The administration had presented the Gulf of Tonkin incidents as a clear case of North Vietnamese aggression, requiring a firm response, the kind of presentation that makes dissent feel irresponsible rather than principled. The 2 senators who did dissent, Wayne Morse of Oregon and Ernest Gruening of Alaska, argued that what was being authorized was a war without a declaration of war, a constitutional anomaly that would remove Congress from its proper role in deciding when the country's soldiers died and for what purpose. They were correct, and they were ignored, and the resolution passed and the trajectory of the following decade was set. It is worth pausing before we follow the escalation forward to understand what South Vietnam actually was by the time American combat forces arrived in force. The country created by the Geneva Accords south of the 17th parallel was not a natural political unit with an organic national identity. It was a construct maintained by American money and American strategic interest, presided over by a series of governments that were almost uniformly unpopular, sometimes brutal, and consistently unable to build the kind of legitimacy that would give ordinary South Vietnamese people a compelling reason to fight and die for it. The first significant leader, Ngo Dinh, was a Catholic Mandarin in a country that was predominantly Buddhist, a man of genuine anti-communist conviction who was also capable of extraordinary ruthlessness toward political opponents, and who governed with a nepotism and contempt for popular opinion that made him enemies faster than American support could neutralize them. When Buddhist monks began publicly protesting his government's religious discrimination in 1963, the protests were suppressed with a violence that appalled American officials and global opinion alike. The image that circulated around the world that summer of an elderly monk sitting in a Saigon street, engulfed in flames, having set himself on fire in protest, was one of those photographs that change how a conflict is understood, that make it impossible for anyone who sees them to maintain the comfortable distance of abstraction. Diem's sister-in-law, a sharp-tongued woman who served as an unofficial first lady, responded to the self-immolation by calling it a barbecue, a remark that completed the process of persuading the Kennedy administration that Diem had become a liability that the United States could no longer afford. He was overthrown in a coup in November of 1963 with American foreknowledge and probable encouragement, and killed shortly after. The governments that followed were no more popular and no more effective, a succession of generals rotating through positions of nominal authority while the actual governance of the countryside remained deeply contested. The American escalation proceeded through 3 presidencies with a logic that was internally coherent and strategically catastrophic. Eisenhower had sent military advisors to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, known as the ARVN, and had committed American prestige to the survival of the South Vietnamese government. Kennedy deepened that commitment substantially, increasing the number of advisors to more than 16,000 and authorizing them to participate in combat operations, though the official position remained that Americans were only advising and not fighting. The line between advising and fighting is difficult to maintain when the people you're advising are being shot at, and American casualties were mounting even before the first official combat units arrived. Johnson inherited a commitment built across 2 previous administrations into something that could not simply be walked away from without political costs. His instincts told him were intolerable, and he escalated, convinced by his advisors that sufficient force would break North Vietnamese will and compel a settlement on terms acceptable to Washington. The 1st Marine Combat Units landed at Da Nang on the 8th of March 1965, and the photographs of them coming ashore, greeted by local girls with flower garlands, have a quality of innocence that the subsequent months and years would make painful to look at. There were 3,500 of them in the initial landing, and the number would grow month by month to 200,000 by the end of 1965 and to more than 500,000 by 1968, the largest American military deployment since the Second World War, committed to a conflict whose strategic premises were flawed in ways that the people making the decisions either could not see or chose not see. Or chose not see. Examine. Let the landing sit here for a moment. 3,500 young men walking up a beach in a country most of them had never heard of before. Their orders came, carrying weapons more sophisticated than anything the Viet Cong possessed. Trained for a kind of warfare that was not the warfare they were going to find. Full of the ordinary confidence of young men who have been told they are on the right side and that they will win, the flowers on their shoulders, the cameras of the journalists, the warm air off the South China Sea, the country watching from the tree line, patient and familiar with this moment, having seen it before. The strategy that General William Westmoreland brought to the war was called attrition. And its fundamental premise was that North Vietnam and the Viet Cong had a finite number of fighters, and that if American forces killed enough of them, faster than they could be replaced, the enemy's capacity to fight would eventually be exhausted. The measurement of success was the body count, the number of enemy dead recorded after each engagement, compiled in briefings in Saigon and transmitted to Washington, used to construct charts and graphs that showed progress being made, and the light at the end of the tunnel drawing closer. The problem with the body count was not simply that the numbers were often inflated, though they were, or that the definition of who counted as an enemy combatant was elastic enough to produce counts that bore little relationship to reality, though that was also true. The deeper problem was that the entire premise was wrong. North Vietnam did not have a finite number of fighters in any sense that was strategically relevant, because the Ho Chi Minh government had a population of roughly 18 million people and a willingness to absorb casualties at a rate that would have been politically catastrophic in any democratic society. And Giap had calculated, correctly, that the American public's tolerance for a war without visible progress was considerably more limited than North Vietnam's. Alongside the ground campaign, The Johnson administration launched Operation Rolling Thunder in March of 1965, a sustained strategic bombing campaign against North Vietnam that would continue, with pauses, until 1968. The theory was that bombing North Vietnamese military and industrial targets would degrade their capacity to support the insurgency in the south and impose a cost high enough to compel Hanoi to negotiate. Over the 3 years of the campaign, American aircraft flew more than 300,000 sorties and dropped more tonnage of bombs on North Vietnam than had been dropped on all targets in the entire Pacific theater during the Second World War. Hanoi dispersed its industry, camouflaged its supply lines, relied on an enormous mobilized civilian workforce to repair bomb damage almost as fast as it could be inflicted, and continued supplying the southern insurgency with sufficient weapons and men to sustain it. North Vietnam was not a government susceptible to the kind of pressure that strategic bombing applies to democracies, because its population, far from being broken by the bombing, developed a quality of collective endurance that became one of the war's most consequential and least expected facts. The domino theory that had driven American policy in Southeast Asia since the early 1950s was, at its core, a theory about the psychology of nations, not an unreasonable one on its face, but applied in Vietnam in a way that obscured a more important truth. The communist movement in Vietnam was not primarily a movement of international communism directed from Moscow or Beijing, though it received material support from both. It was primarily a nationalist movement, a continuation of the resistance that had expelled the Chinese and then the French, now directed against the Americans who had replaced them. The force that sustained the movement, that kept fighters in the field and villagers supplying food and intelligence across decades of war, was not communism. It was the refusal of the Vietnamese people to be governed by people who were not Vietnamese. The ARVN, the South Vietnamese army the Americans were fighting alongside, was a persistent disappointment. Individual units and individual soldiers performed with considerable courage on occasion, and the war produced genuine South Vietnamese heroes whose stories have been somewhat buried by the subsequent narrative. But as an institution, the ARVN was undermined by the same problems that undermined every South Vietnamese government. Officers who reached senior positions tended to be those who had cultivated connections rather than those who could fight. Corruption was endemic at every level, and the fundamental question of what South Vietnam was and why it was worth dying for remained unanswered, in a way that was dying for, remained unanswered, in a way that Phu Can made unit cohesion perpetually fragile. American advisors wrote reports documenting the same problems year after year, and the optimistic briefings continued, because the alternative to optimism was to acknowledge that the entire project might not be salvageable. The draft that filled the American military in Vietnam drew with systematic unfairness from the lower rungs of American society. Men from wealthy or educated backgrounds had access to deferments and to the kind of legal and medical advice that made it possible to demonstrate unfitness for service in ways not available to men without those resources. The result was a military drawn disproportionately from working class and poor communities, from Black and Hispanic and rural white populations, from the parts of America that lacked the social capital to navigate the system's escape routes. The racial dimension was stark. Black Americans served in the combat arms at rates significantly higher than their proportion of the population and died in the early years at similarly elevated rates. A disparity that the civil rights movement noted with bitter clarity, pointing out that young black men were being asked to die for freedoms in Southeast Asia that they did not yet fully possess at age 8. Muhammad Ali, who refused induction in 1967 on grounds of religious conviction and opposition to the war, was stripped of his heavyweight championship and faced a prison sentence a piece of theatre that illustrated with unusual clarity the contradictions of asking a country to fight for freedom abroad while denying it at home. The young men who did go, who served and fought in the jungles and the deltas and the highlands of Vietnam, were for the most part doing what soldiers have always done, following orders, looking after each other, trying to survive the immediate situation in a conflict whose strategic logic was above their pay grade and whose daily reality was more immediate and more frightening than any strategy would encompass. The letters they sent home have a quality that distinguishes them from the letters of previous wars, a quality of bewilderment that is not the bewilderment of men facing a comprehensible enemy in a comprehensible landscape, but the deeper disorientation of men fighting a war that does not have a front, that has no territory to be taken and held, that measures its progress in dead bodies and offers nothing that looks like progress in return. They were not wrong to be bewildered. They were fighting a war that nobody in the American system, from the president down to the lowest-ranking private, and yet admitted could not be won in any conventionally recognizable sense. The first year of full American combat involvement did not go badly by some measures. The Battle of Ia Drang Valley in November of 1965 was the first major engagement between American forces and regular North Vietnamese army units, and the Americans won it, inflicting casualties at a ratio that, by the logic of attrition warfare, should have been discouraging to the North Vietnamese. It was not discouraging to Giap, who examined the battle afterward and drew the conclusion that the Americans, with their helicopters and their artillery and their close air support, were too powerful to fight directly, and that the appropriate response was to continue the strategy that had worked against the French. Stay close enough to the Americans to neutralize their air power advantage, fight when conditions were favorable and withdraw when they were not, keep the cost rising for the American public while keeping North Vietnamese losses within a range that the political leadership in Hanoi judged acceptable. The Battle of Ia Drang told both sides something important about the war they were in. The Americans concluded that attrition could work. Giap concluded that time would work. One of those conclusions was right. The particular disorientation of fighting this war versus the war that the training and the briefings had described was not simply tactical, it was moral and psychological, accumulating over the months of a tour of duty in a way that produced in many of the men who went through it a kind of estrangement from the official story, a private knowledge that what they were experiencing bore no relationship to the progress reports being sent to Washington and no relationship to the confident assessments being offered at press conferences in Saigon. The gap between the official version of the war and the experienced version of the war, small in the early months of 1965, would widen steadily through 1966 and 1967 and into 1968, until an event in late January of that year made it impossible for anyone, even the optimists in Washington, to pretend the gap was not there. The confusion of those first months, the first intimation that the war being prepared for and the war that was actually happening were different wars, was the beginning of something that would not resolve itself until the last helicopter left Saigon a decade later. There is a quality to the escalation years, the period from 1965 to 1967, that is important to name before we follow the story into its next phase. It is the quality of a system that has committed itself to a course of action and then organized all of its reporting and assessment around confirming that the course of action is working. The journalists who covered the war from Saigon, men like David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan, who were there from the earliest advisory years, were reporting by the mid-1960s what the soldiers in the field were experiencing, a war that bore no resemblance to the official briefings, a Viet Cong that was not being defeated, a South Vietnamese government that was not being defeated, a South Vietnamese government that was not gaining legitimacy. was not being pacified. Their reporting was challenged, resisted, and in some cases personally attacked by the administration and by the military command in Saigon, not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient, because it described a reality that contradicted the policy, and the policy could not be changed without someone admitting that it had been wrong. The credibility gap, the growing distance between what the government said was happening and what was actually happening, was not simply a failure of communication. It was a failure of honesty, sustained across years, and its eventual collapse would be among the most consequential events in American political history. The war was also, by 1967, producing effects inside the United States that its architects had not anticipated and could not control. The anti-war movement that had begun on university campuses in 1965 had grown, by 1967, into a genuine mass movement that included not only students and intellectuals, but veterans, civil rights leaders, religious figures, and ordinary Americans who had simply looked at the evidence and concluded that what their government was telling them was not true. Martin Luther King spoke out against the war in April of 1967, connecting it explicitly to the poverty and racial injustice he had been fighting for more than a decade, arguing that the billions being spent in Vietnam were billions not being spent on American cities and American schools and American poor, and that the men dying in the jungles disproportionately were the same men whose communities were being failed at home. The protest marches grew larger. The arguments about the war became more intense. The country that had entered the war with something approaching consensus was fracturing along lines that the war had created or deepened or made impossible to ignore, and the fracture would widen considerably in the months ahead. The war that was being fought in the Delta and the highlands and the tunnels beneath the red earth of Ho Chi district was not the war that was being reported in the briefing rooms of Saigon, and understanding that gap between the experienced war and the administered war is the key to understanding everything that came next. We can go deeper now into the specific texture of that experience, into the underground world that the Viet Cong built beneath the American boots, and into the sky above it where the bombers flew in their thousands, and the ground below them absorbed what was dropped and went on, because the middle years of this war from 1965 to the eve of the Tet Offensive are the years in which both sides were discovering what kind of war they were actually fighting, and the discoveries were very different in character for each of them. He was 20 years old, or 19, or 22. He was from Ohio, or Georgia, or California, or any of the other places that American boys came from in the 1960s, and he was lying on his stomach at the entrance to a hole in the ground that was approximately the width of his shoulders, looking down into darkness with a pistol in one hand and a flashlight in the other, and the absolute certainty, built up over weeks of operating in this particular district, that what was in that hole was not nothing. The hole was in the laterite soil of Ho Chi district, north of Saigon, red-brown and dense, and it went down and then sideways and then down again, and it connected to other holes, and those holes connected to others still, and the whole system ran for 250 kilometers beneath the surface of the earth, one of the most extraordinary feats of military engineering in the history of warfare, built without heavy machinery over the course of years by people working by hand in terrible conditions for a cause they believed in with absolute conviction. The men who went into those tunnels were called tunnel rats, an unofficial designation that captures something of the nature of the assignment, which was essentially to be a human extension of a flashlight into a space that was designed to kill anyone who entered uninvited. The tunnels were booby-trapped at intervals with pressure plates and tripwires and punji stakes, and the particular ingenuity of people who had spent years thinking about how to make a confined space as lethal as possible for anyone who did not know exactly where every trap was. They were also occupied, at least some of the time, by Viet Cong fighters who had not had time to withdraw and who were in the dark waiting with the same kind of patience that characterized everything about the Viet Cong's way of fighting this war. The tunnel rats went in anyway, because someone had to, and because the tunnels were command centers and hospitals and weapons storage facilities and rest areas and everything that kept the Southern insurgency functioning, and the American command understood that destroying them was important, even if nobody had quite worked out how to do it safely. The Ho Chi tunnel system had been started by Viet Minh fighters during the resistance against the French and had been extended and deepened and elaborated over the following decade into something that bore almost no relationship to its original, modest beginnings. By the mid-1960s, the tunnels ran beneath several American military bases without the Americans on top of them knowing, a situation that produced incidents of underground infiltration that seemed to the Americans who encountered them impossible, and to the Viet Cong fighters who executed them merely a technical exercise requiring careful planning and nerve. The tunnels had sleeping quarters and kitchens and operating theaters and meeting rooms and printing facilities for propaganda materials. All of it underground, lit by oil lamps or candles, ventilated through carefully concealed shafts, connected to the surface through trapdoors disguised as sections of ordinary ground. An entire functioning society existed beneath the surface of the earth, one that could survive bombing campaigns and ground operations and prolonged encirclement because it was invisible and because the people in it had developed the capacity to live underground for extended periods in conditions that would have been psychologically intolerable to most of the soldiers searching for them on the surface above. The women who lived in the tunnels, and there were many of them, serving as fighters and nurses and engineers and political organizers, describe in their accounts a world of absolute darkness during the day, when any movement above ground was too dangerous, and careful emergence at night to tend the gardens that grew food for the community, to move supplies, to carry out the above-ground activity that life required. They lived like this for years. Some of them were born in the tunnels. The tunnels were not simply a military asset. They were a demonstration, sustained over years, of the kind of endurance that this war required, and that one side of it had, and the other did not. The American response to the tunnels included the tunnel rats, but also included massive bombing and the use of chemical defoliants, most notably a herbicide known as Agent Orange, which was sprayed from aircraft over enormous areas of Vietnamese forest and farmland in an attempt to deny the Viet Cong the vegetation cover that made their movements possible. The defoliation program was conducted on a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend. By the war's end, roughly 18% of the total forest cover of South Vietnam had been sprayed, an area of millions of hectares, and the herbicide had entered the soil and the water table and the food chain in ways that would take decades to understand and that continue to affect the health of Vietnam. As people today, the intention was to make the country transparent from the air, to remove the cover that made it possible for the Viet Cong to move and supply themselves without detection. The actual effect was to create a landscape of devastated forest and poisoned land that deepened the hatred of many Vietnamese people for the power that had done this to their country, and that made it harder rather than easier to win the population's allegiance. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply route that ran through Laos and Cambodia along the western border of Vietnam and fed weapons and men and food and ammunition to the southern insurgency, was the logistical achievement that made everything else possible and that resisted every attempt to shut it down. The trail was not a single road, but a network of paths and tracks and roads and river crossings, constantly expanded and repaired and rerouted, maintained by an army of laborers, many of them young women, who repaired bomb craters and carried supplies on bicycles and on their backs through terrain that the Americans' maps showed as impenetrable. The Americans bombed the trail for years with everything they had, and the trail continued to function because the Vietnamese on it simply repaired the damage, often within hours of the bombing, and continued. The women who maintained the trail became one of the war's unsung stories. Young women in their teens and 20s who served in the volunteer youth brigades, living in the forest, working through the night to fill craters and repair bridges and keep the routes passable, sleeping in makeshift shelters during the day when the bombing was heaviest, eating the same sparse rations as the fighters passing through. Their casualty rates were extremely high. They were bombed continually and shelled when artillery could reach the routes, and they kept working. The accounts of the women who survived describe a quality of determination that operated below the level of ideology, sustained by something closer to habit and community, and the simple refusal to let the road stay closed, a refusal that was replicated in one form or another at every point in the Vietnamese war effort where a human decision was required to absorb more punishment and continue. A system maintained by human determination and human labor turned out to be considerably more resilient than the planners of the bombing campaigns had anticipated, because the planners thought in terms of industrial systems, and the trail was not an industrial system, It was a human one, and human systems absorb damage differently from mechanical ones. Rest here for a moment in the middle of this underground war, in the dark of a tunnel in Ho Chi Minh district, where the air smells of earth and oil and sweat and something else. The particular smell of people who have been living underground for a long time and have made a kind of peace with the darkness. The silence down here is different from the silence above. It is the silence of the earth itself, which has been here longer than the war, and will be here when the war is over, patient and dense and indifferent to the calculations being made on its surface. The American strategy of attrition required measuring things that could be measured, and the things that could be measured were not always the things that mattered. Helicopters flew more than 1 million sorties in a single year at the height of the war, moving troops and supplies and wounded men with a speed and flexibility that no previous conflict had seen, creating a kind of three-dimensional battlefield that was unprecedented. Artillery fired millions of rounds into the Vietnamese countryside, rounds directed by spotters and observers and sophisticated targeting systems. The mathematics of destruction applied with enormous precision to a war that could not be won by mathematics. Search and destroy missions swept through districts and hamlets and returned with body counts and prisoner counts and weapons captures that were entered into databases and analyzed by analysts in Saigon and Washington, who produced reports showing that progress was being made. What a search and destroy mission actually felt like at the level of the soldiers conducting it was something different from what any of those numbers could convey. A patrol of 10 or 15 men moving through thick jungle or open paddy fields in temperatures that reached 40 degrees, carrying 50 kilograms of equipment, watching every step for mines and booby traps, unable to distinguish the farmers working in the fields from the fighters who would be there after dark, arriving in a village and finding nothing, always nothing, the same blankly cooperati faces, and the same absence of weapons, and the same sense that whatever had been here had left shortly before they arrived. The mines were the worst of it. The particular dread of the ground itself as a weapon. Every step a potential detonation. Every stretch of trail a possible death that gave no warning and offered no chance. More American casualties in Vietnam came from mines and booby traps than from any other single cause. A fact that shaped the psychology of the ground war in ways that went well beyond the casualty statistics, creating a quality of generalized fear that made the landscape itself feel hostile in a way that conventional warfare, with its identifiable enemy and its visible front, does not produce. The progress that was being made was real in one sense. American forces killed a very large number of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese fighters across the middle years of the war, in numbers that, by the logic of attrition, should have degraded the enemy's capacity to continue. The problem was that the enemy's capacity to continue was not primarily military in nature. It was political and social and cultural, rooted in a population that had decided, or been persuaded, or found itself unable to imagine any alternative, that resistance was the appropriate response to the American presence, that the cost of continuing was preferable to the cost of stopping. Villages that the American and South Vietnamese forces entered and swept and searched and left, having tallied their counts and moved on, were often providing food and shelter and intelligence to Viet Cong units within days of the sweep. Not necessarily because the villages were enthusiastic communists, but because the Viet Cong were present and persistent, and the South Vietnamese government was distant and corrupt, and the Americans were transient, always moving on to the next operation, never staying long enough to establish the kind of sustained relationship with the population that might have changed the political calculation. The pacification program, which ran alongside the military operations and aimed to win the population's allegiance through economic development and improved governance, was underfunded and inconsistently administered and operating against the same headwinds that frustrated every other aspect of the effort to build a viable South Vietnam. The Strategic Hamlet Program, which tried to relocate rural Vietnamese into fortified villages where they could be protected from Viet Cong influence and controlled by South Vietnamese authorities, was implemented in ways that were often coercive and that produced deep resentment among the people it was supposed to help. People who were being uprooted from land their families had farmed for rations and moved into enclosed settlements that felt like camps. The program generated statistics showing that large numbers of hamlets had been pacified, and the statistics were entered into the databases. And the databases showed progress, and the progress was not happening in any way that was visible on the ground. The Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support Program, known by the acronym CORD-ZE, later attempt to coordinate the civilian and military sides of pacification into a more coherent effort, and it produced some genuine improvements in specific districts at specific times, results that gave American officials in Saigon reason to report progress with at least partial sincerity. But the fundamental problem was not organizational. It was that the South Vietnamese government, which any pacification effort ultimately depended on for its legitimacy, was not trusted by the people it was supposed to govern, and no amount of American money or organizational sophistication could substitute for that trust. The Viet Cong political cadres who worked the villages, who collected taxes and adjudicated local disputes and organized resistance committees and ran literacy programs, and were, in many cases, people who had grown up in those same villages, had a credibility with the local population that the agents of the South Vietnamese government could not match, and that the presence of American soldiers, each over well-intentioned, actively undermined. There is a particular kind of political authority that comes from being from a place, from knowing its history and its grievances and its people by name, and it cannot be imported or funded into existence. The Viet Cong had it. The South Vietnamese government, dependent on American support and organized from Saigon outward, largely did not. The men doing the actual fighting in the jungle and the highlands and the delta were, by 1967, accumulating a private knowledge that the official version of events could not accommodate. They had been told they were winning. They had been told that the enemy was being degraded, that the kill ratios were in their favor, that the strategic situation was improving. What they experienced on the ground, day after day, was an enemy that kept coming, that kept appearing where it should not have been able to appear, that absorbed the kills and the captures and the sweeps and the bombardments, and kept coming back. The rotation system, which sent soldiers home after a 12-month tour of duty and replaced them with fresh soldiers who had to begin the whole learning process again, meant that the institutional knowledge that accumulates in a unit over time, the knowledge of local geography and local customs and local patterns of Viet Cong activity, was continually being erased and rebuilt. A soldier who survived his first 6 months in Vietnam and understood, in the way that survival teaches understanding, exactly how to read the landscape he was operating in, was sent home just as he was becoming genuinely effective. Replaced by someone who had to learn the same lessons from the beginning. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters he had been opposing had been in the same landscape for years, or for their entire adult lives. The knowledge gap that rotation created was not visible in any of the metrics being collected, but it was real, and it compounded every other asymmetry in the conflict. The kill ratios were real, in the sense that the Americans were killing Viet Cong and North Vietnamese fighters in large numbers. But the ratios existed in a strategic vacuum, numbers that looked like winning inside a framework that was losing. The question of what it means to fight a war, in which every measurement points toward victory, while the actual situation refuses to resolve itself into anything recognizable as progress, is not a new question in the history of warfare. But it was new to America, whose military tradition was built on a different kind of conflict, on the idea that superior firepower and superior logistics, applied wit, age determination would produce a decisive outcome. What Vietnam had instead was the particular quality of a war in which every metric of military performance, the body counts and the kill ratios and the hamlets pacified and the sorties flown and the tonnage of ordnance delivered, added up to numbers that look like winning, while the actual situation, measured not in bodies but in political will and popular allegiance and the simple stubborn quest, ion, of who was going to be governing this country in 20 years, looked like something else entirely. The numbers kept growing, the situation kept not resolving, and in Hanoi, Giap watched the numbers growing and the situation not resolving, and began to plan the operation that would make the gap between the two impossible to ignore. The gap between the war that was happening and the war that was being reported had been widening for 3 years, a slow accumulation of contradictions that the American public sensed but could not quite name, could feel in the space between the official optimism and the casualty lists that ran in the local newspapers beside the photographs of young men from the neighborhood. We can move forward now into the last week of January 1968, into the moment when that gap was closed, not by a journalist or a senator or a presidential admission, but by the North Vietnamese army itself, which chose the occasion of the Vietnamese Lunar New Year to demonstrate with terrible clarity that everything the public had been told about the war's trajectory was not true, because the Tet Offensive was not simply a military operation. It was a communication addressed to the American people, and its message was received. The television was on in the living room. It was February of 1968, and the family watching it had been told for the past 3 years that the war in Vietnam was going badly for the enemy, that progress was being made, that the American-backed South Vietnamese government was gaining strength and the Viet Cong were being degraded, that the light at the end of the tunnel was genuinely visible to those in a position to assess these things. What was on the television now, in real time, transmitted by satellite from Saigon, was footage of fighting inside the grounds of the American Embassy, one of the most heavily fortified and symbolically significant installations in South Vietnam, a compound that embodied in concrete and wire the confidence and permanence of the American presence. Viet Cong fighters had breached the outer wall and were fighting inside the compound itself. The family sat and watched this in a silence that was not the silence of incomprehension, but of a different kind of understanding. The understanding that arrives when the gap between what you have been told and what is actually the case becomes visible and inescapable. The Tet Offensive began in the early hours of the 30th of January 1968, the first day of the year of the monkey in the Vietnamese lunar calendar, a day on which a truce had been customarily observed and on which the South Vietnamese army had granted extensive leave to its soldiers. It had been planned for months by Giap and the North Vietnamese leadership, planned with a secrecy and an ambition that the American intelligence services, for all their technical sophistication, had failed to fully anticipate. The operational concept was to launch simultaneous attacks on more than 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns, including every major urban center in the country, coordinated with an assault on the American garrison at Khe Sanh in the northwest that was designed to draw attention and resources away from the cities. The attacks were to be carried out by a combination of regular North Vietnamese army units and Viet Cong fighters, who had been infiltrated into the cities over the preceding weeks. Some of them disguised as civilians, others hiding in safe houses, all of them waiting for the signal. The signal came, and they struck simultaneously across the country, and for the first day or two the situation was genuinely chaotic in a way that reflected the scale and coordination of the operation. In Saigon, the attacks on the embassy and the presidential palace and other key installations were repulsed within hours, but the fighting in the city's streets and the images it produced were transmitted directly into American living rooms in ways that no previous battle in any previous war had been, because this was the first war fought in the age of satellite television. The photograph that came to define the immediate brutality of Tet was taken on a Saigon street, not on a battlefield. A South Vietnamese general named Nguyen Ngoc Loan raising a pistol to the head of a captured Viet Cong prisoner and firing the prisoner's face at the moment of death, caught in freeze frame by Eddie Adams's camera and transmitted around the world within hours. The image was morally complex in ways that the public reaction to it largely did not accommodate, but its impact on American opinion was not complex at all. It made the war look like something other than what the official briefings described. In Hue, the battle was more prolonged, and its aftermath more terrible. North Vietnamese forces captured most of the city in the first hours of the offensive and held it for 25 days, during which American Marines and South Vietnamese forces fought through the streets and across the citadel in the most intense urban combat American forces had experienced since the Second World War, a grinding block-by-block battle that reduced significant portions of one of Vietnam's most beautiful and historically important cities to rubble. The retaking of Hue cost roughly 500 American and South Vietnamese lives, and several thousand North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters, numbers that measure only the military cost and say nothing about what happened to the city itself or to the civilians who were caught inside it. During the occupation, a systematic execution of people identified as government officials or military personnel, or anyone with associations to the South Vietnamese state, was carried out by the occupying forces, an atrocity that claimed several thousand civilian lives and that has complicated, in ways that are historically important to acknowledge, any simple moral reading of the war. The massacre at Hue was not reported with anything approaching the attention given to the embassy or the Cronkite broadcast, partly because it took weeks for the full scale of it to become clear, and partly because it did not fit cleanly into the narrative framework through which American audiences were understanding the conflict. The Battle of Khe Sanh, the siege of an American Marine base in the northwest of the country that Giap had begun just before the Tet Offensive and that continued through the spring of 1968, absorbed enormous American attention and resources in exactly the way the North Vietnamese had intended. Johnson followed the battle obsessively, having a model of the terrain built in the White House Situation Room, convinced that Khe Sanh was Giap's version of Dien Bien Phu, an attempt to produce a decisive defeat that would break American will as Dien Bien Phu had broken French will. Whether Giap intended Khe Sanh as a genuine attempt to overrun the base or as a strategic feint designed to fix American attention in the north while the Tet attacks were prepared in the cities is a question that historians have argued about without reaching a definitive answer. The base held. The siege was lifted. and the Tet Offensive was over. Its military objectives unachieved, its strategic consequences larger than anything that had happened in the war up to that point. The military outcome of the Tet Offensive was a serious defeat for North Vietnam. The Viet Cong, who provided most of the fighters for the urban attacks, suffered casualties from which they never fully recovered as an independent fighting force, with estimates suggesting that somewhere between 40 and 50,000 fighters died in the offensive and its immediate aftermath. The general uprising of the South Vietnamese population that Giap had hoped would accompany and amplify the attacks did not materialize. The urban population, confronted with the reality of the offensive rather than the theory, did not rise against the government. The North Vietnamese failed to hold any of the cities they attacked for more than a few weeks, and in most cases for much less. By conventional military metrics, the offensive was a failure. Sit with that paradox for a moment, because it is the central paradox of the entire war in miniature. The North Vietnamese lost the Tet Offensive militarily. They lost it badly in terms of fighters killed and objectives not achieved, and the general uprising that did not come. And yet, within 3 months of the offensive, the President of the United States had announced that he would not seek re-election. The American strategy of attrition had been effectively abandoned, and the United States had committed itself to a process that would end with its forces leaving Vietnam entirely. A military defeat had produced a strategic victory of historic proportions, not because of what happened on the ground in Hue or Saigon, but because of what happened in the minds of the American public. Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam to see the Tet Offensive for himself. He was the anchor of the CBS Evening News, the most trusted journalist in America by the polling of the time, a man whose measured authority had shaped the American public's understanding of events for more than a decade, and whose reports from the Second World War and the space program had given him a credibility that extended well beyond the usual trust placed in newscasters. He had been, up to this point, careful about the war, reporting it without editorializing, maintaining the journalistic neutrality that his profession valued and his temperament inclined him toward. What he saw in Vietnam in February of 1968 changed his assessment, and what he said on his broadcast on the 27th of February is one of the most consequential single acts of journalism in the 20th century. He said that the war appeared to him to be a stalemate, that it could not be won militarily, and that the only way out was a negotiated settlement that would accept less than victory. He said it in the measured, authoritative voice of a man who has looked at the facts and drawn a conclusion and is telling the truth as he sees it. The broadcast was not the turning point. It was the symbol of the turning point, the public articulation of a conclusion that millions of Americans had already been approaching privately and now heard confirmed by someone they trusted. The turning point itself was the Tet Offensive, which in a single week had made the official story indefensible in a way that no previous event had managed, because it was visible, because it happened on television, because the gap between what the government had been saying about the war and what was actually happening could now be seen by anyone with a television set in a way that did not require reading a newspaper or trusting a journalist's interpretation. The images spoke directly, without mediation, and what they said was that the war was not what the government had said it was. That realization, once arrived at, could not be unarrived at. There is a further element to the year following Tet that is important to name before we move on, because it deepened the public's alienation from the official account of the war in ways that went beyond anything Tet itself had produced. In November of 1969, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published the story of what had happened in the village of My Lai in March of 1968, 6 weeks after the Tet Offensive. A unit of American soldiers, operating in Quang Ngai province, had entered the village and killed between 300 and 500 unarmed civilians, almost all of them women, children, and elderly men over the course of several hours. The massacre had been covered up for more than a year and a half. When it became public, the photographs and the accounts produced a moral reckoning in American public life that went well beyond the strategic debates about whether the war could be won. My lie forced a different question. What kind of war was this, and what was it doing to the people who were fighting it, and what did it say about the country that had sent them there? These were not questions that had easy answers, and the difficulty of answering them honestly became part of what the war meant in American memory. Long after the last shot was fired, Lyndon Johnson, watching in the White House, said that if he had lost Walter Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. The remark has been quoted so often that it risks becoming a cliché, but the meaning behind it is worth attending to because it describes something real about the relationship between a democratic government and the public it serves, a relationship that requires a minimum of shared reality to function and that collapses when the gap between the official account and the experienced reality becomes too wide to sustain. The official account of the war, the progress reports and the body counts, and the light at the end of the tunnel had been built on optimistic assessments that the people making them may have partially believed, or may have believed they needed to believe, or may have believed were necessary to sustain public support for a war they were not certain they could win by other means. The Tet Offensive made those assessments indefensible in public, which is not quite the same as making them false, because the military situation after Tet was in some ways more favorable for the Americans than it had been before, but which made it impossible to continue the war on the political terms that had sustained it up to that point. Johnson had been showing private signs of exhaustion for months before Tet, the exhaustion of a man who had committed himself to a war that was consuming his presidency and his health, and who had found no way to win it or to leave it, that did not carry costs he was not willing to pay. He had wanted to be remembered for his domestic achievements, for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Great Society programs that had done more for the material welfare of poor Americans than any legislation since the New Deal. And instead, he was presiding over a war that was tearing the country apart and absorbing the money and the political energy that might otherwise have won to the programs he cared about. The Tet Offensive and the political aftermath of the Tet Offensive made the calculation definitive. On the 31st of March 1968, Johnson addressed the nation, announced a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam, and ended his speech with the statement that he would not seek and would not accept the nomination of his party for another term as president. He had been consumed by the war he had chosen, or that had chosen him, and now he was leaving it to whoever came next. The fracturing of American society that the war produced and accelerated was not simply the anti-war movement, though the anti-war movement was real and significant, and had by 1968 included not only students and intellectuals, but veterans of the war itself, men who had come home and found the war they had fought indefensible in ways they had not been able to see while they were fighting it. An organization called Vietnam Veterans Against the War had formed, and its members appeared in testimony and demonstrations, and in a particular moment in April of 1971 that was among the most striking pieces of political theater of the era. Hundreds of veterans in fatigues, many of them decorated, standing in lines at the Capitol and throwing their medals and ribbons over a fence toward the building that had sent them to war. A gesture whose quiet fury was more articulate than any speech. The fracture ran deeper than the war, along lines of race and class and generation and trust that the war had exposed or widened but had not created. Fault lines that had been present in American society long before the first American soldier arrived in Vietnam. The year 1968 was, in retrospect, one of the most extraordinary in American political history. The assassination of Martin Luther King in April, the assassination of Robert Kennedy in June, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August, where police beat protesters in the streets outside while the delegates inside argued about a war that had killed the president who had started it. Ali. The election of Richard Nixon in November, on a promise of a plan to end the war that he did not yet have and would not fully implement for 5 more years. The country that elected Nixon was not the country that had elected Johnson or Kennedy or Eisenhower. It was a country that had been changed by the war in ways that would take decades to understand. A country in which the trust between the government and the governed had been so damaged by the systematic gap between what was said and what was true that rebuilding it would require something more than a change of president or a change of policy. That damage was the war's other legacy, the one that lasted in American political life long after the last helicopter had left Saigon. The specific recognition that marks the end of this phase of the story and that makes the Tet Offensive the pivot point it was, is not a military one. It is the recognition that the story of the war has changed its nature. Up to January of 1968, the story of the war had been a story about whether the United States would win, a story about strategy and tactics and political will and the capabilities of the North Vietnamese enemy, a story that still contained within it the theoretical possibility of a satisfactory outcome. After Tet, the story became something else. It became a story about how the United States would leave, about the price it would pay and the time it would take and the shape of the settlement that would allow the withdrawal to be dressed in some approximation of dignity. The question was no longer whether America would win. The question was how it would end, and the answer to that question would take another 7 years to arrive, at an enormous cost in lives on both sides, and would look nothing like a victory. The story of the war had changed its nature, and so the war itself had to change, though changing a war is a slower and more expensive process than changing a story, and the years between the Tet Offensive and the final collapse of South Vietnam were years of a particular kind of grinding, a conflict that everyone involved understood to be ending without any of the people most responsible for ending it being willing or able to make the decisions that would actually end it. We can move forward now into the final phase, which began not with a military event, but with a photograph taken on a university campus in Ohio of something that should never have happened and that happened anyway, because the war had arrived home. Because that is the final thing a war like this does when it has exhausted the battlefield. It comes home to the country that sent it. She was lying on the grass at Kent State University on the 4th of May 1970, and another student was kneeling beside her with her arms spread wide in a gesture that seems to contain grief and incomprehension and a kind of bewildered appeal all at once. And John Philo's photograph of that moment, taken within seconds of the National Guard opening fire on unarmed student protesters, is one of those images that become larger than the event that produced them, that lodge in the memory of a culture and do not leave. 4 students died at Kent State that afternoon, killed by National Guard soldiers called in to manage protests against the secret American bombing of Cambodia that Nixon had announced 4 days earlier. Protests that were a predictable response to the news that the war that was supposedly winding down had been expanded into a neutral country without the knowledge of Congress or the American public. This peeping, they say, the photograph said, with a clarity that no editorial could match, that the violence of this war had arrived at a place where it was not supposed to be, on a campus in Ohio, and that the people it had killed were not soldiers but students, which was itself a category of person that the war had been consuming for years in a different way through the draft and the protests and the particular kind of damage that comes from watching your country do something you believe is wrong. Richard Nixon had been elected in 1968 on a promise to end the war honorably, and the policy he pursued was called Vietnamization, which was a program of gradually transferring the military burden of the war to the ARVN while reducing American troop levels, on the theory that if the South Vietnamese forces were properly equipped and trained, they could eventually sustain their own defense. The theory was not without merit as a theory, and some of the training and equipment provided did produce genuine improvements in specific ARVN units in specific areas. But the fundamental problem that had undermined every previous effort to build a capable South Vietnamese military had not been solved and could not be solved by equipment or training alone. The problem of political legitimacy of a government that a significant portion of its own population did not believe in and would not die for remained the central unanswerable question of the entire American project in Vietnam. Vietnamization could build a better army. It could not build a better cause. American troop levels did fall steadily under Nixon, from the peak of more than 500,000 in 1968 to fewer than 50,000 by 1972, and the casualty rate fell with them, which was the domestic political objective of the policy. The falling casualty rate reduced the intensity of the anti-war movement somewhat, as the direct personal stake that young American men had in the war's continuation diminished with the reduced likelihood of being drafted into it. But the war continued, and the North Vietnamese continued to fight it, and the South Vietnamese continued to die in it in large numbers, and the underlying situation, the balance of political will and popular legitimacy between the two sides, had not changed in any way that Vietnamization could address. Nixon bought time with the policy. He did not buy a solution. The secret bombing of Cambodia and Laos, which had been ongoing since 1969, and which Nixon revealed the Cambodian component of in April of 1970, was an attempt to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail and destroy the North Vietnamese military infrastructure that used Cambodian and Laotian territory as a sanctuary, areas where American ground forces were not permitted to operate, and where the North Vietnamese had accordingly based significant quantities of supplies and troops. The bombing did damage to North Vietnamese operations, and it did something else as well. It destabilized Cambodia, whose government was overthrown in a coup in 1970 that brought to power a pro-American military government, which in turn drove the Cambodian communist movement, the Khmer Rouge, to expand its operations, which in turn eventually led to one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. The connections between the American bombing of Cambodia and the rise of the Khmer Rouge are complex and contested, but they are real, and they represent one of the war's longest and most terrible downstream consequences, one that its architects did not foresee, and that its critics could not have imagined, even in their most catastrophist moments. The Pentagon Papers, published by the New York Times in June of 1971, were a classified study of American decision-making about Vietnam commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and completed in 1968, a 7,000-page document that revealed, in meticulous and damning detail, the gap between what successive administrations had told the American public about the war and what they had known and believed internally. The papers showed that presidents and their advisors had consistently misled the public about the war's prospects, about the nature of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, about the likelihood that military escalation would produce the desired results, about the assessments of their own intelligence agencies, which had repeatedly produced more pessimistic and more accurate evaluations of the situation than the public statements of those same agencies' political masters. The Nixon administration attempted to prevent publication and was overruled by the Supreme Court, a legal defeat that deepened the administration's paranoid siege mentality and contributed to the series of decisions that would eventually produce Watergate. The papers did not change the war. They confirmed for millions of Americans who had suspected it that they had been systematically lied to for more than a decade. Let the weight of that settle for a moment. In the quiet between the revelations and the responses to them, in the space between what a government has done and what it means that it has done it. The trust that a democratic government requires from its citizens to sustain the kind of commitments that a war demands had been spent down to nothing and below nothing, and what was left was not opposition to the war which had been present since the beginning, but something deeper and more damaging, a generalized suspicion of authority, an assumption of bad faith in official statements, a dident conviction that the gap between the public account and the private reality was a permanent feature of the relationship between American government and the American people rather than an aberration produced by this particular crisis. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973, negotiated by Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho over the course of 4 years of intermittent and often stalled talks, were celebrated as the end of American involvement in Vietnam, but were understood by most serious observers to be a face-saving mechanism rather than a genuine resolution of the underlying conflict. The Accords provided for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of American forces, and the return of American prisoners of war, and they left the North Vietnamese army in place in the territories of South Vietnam it occupied at the time of signing, which was a concession that made the eventual outcome of the conflict, if the ceasefire broke down, reasonably predictable. Nixon and Kissinger called it peace with honor. The North Vietnamese called it a victory. The South Vietnamese government, which had been pressured into signing an agreement it knew was likely to lead to its own destruction, said very little publicly and began preparing for the war it expected to resume when the Americans had gone. The American prisoners of war who came home in February and March of 1973, following the signing of the Accords, were received with a warmth and a public ceremony that the returning veterans of the previous 8 years of the conflict had largely not experienced. The men who had fought in the jungles in the Delta and come home year by year through the late 1960s and early 1970s had returned to a country that was deeply ambivalent about the war they had fought, a country that did not know how to separate its feelings about the war from its feelings about the people who had fought it, and had often resolved that ambivalence in ways that were deeply unfair to the men who had done what their country asked. The stories of veterans being called murderers at airports, of suppressing their service because it generated hostility rather than gratitude, of struggling with physical and psychological wounds in a Veterans Administration system that was overwhelmed and under-equipped, are a specific kind of American wound from the Vietnam era, one that the country would spend decades slowly attempting to acknowledge and address. The men who spent years as prisoners of war in Hanoi, many of them subjected to torture and prolonged isolation, came home to a hero's welcome that was partly genuine and partly the public's way of finding a group of Vietnam veterans it could unambiguously celebrate after years of not knowing what to do with the complicated, ambiguously difficult men who had actually done most of the fighting. The Americans left. The ceasefire broke down. The war resumed, slowly at first, and then with increasing speed, as the North Vietnamese tested the South Vietnamese defenses and found them shakier than even the pessimists had predicted. The American Congress, responding to public exhaustion with the war and to the revelations of the Pentagon Papers and to the general collapse of trust in executive authority that Watergate had accelerated, cut the funding that had been keeping the South Vietnamese military operational, a decision that had immediate and concrete effects on the ARM's ability to fight. Ammunition became scarce, fuel became scarce, spare parts became scarce, and the units that had been performing adequately when well supplied began to crumble when the supplies stopped. The North Vietnamese watched this process with the attentiveness of an army that has been waiting for 20 years and knows that the waiting is almost over. The final offensive began in March of 1975, and the collapse of the South Vietnamese military was faster and more total than even Hanoi had expected. Provinces fell in days, cities in hours, entire divisions disintegrating as officers fled, and soldiers found themselves fighting without orders or support or any remaining reason to believe that anyone was coming to help them. the panic spread faster than the advancing North Vietnamese forces, a wave of fear and abandonment running ahead of the military situation, a physical manifestation of the political failure that had been at the heart of the South Vietnamese project from the beginning. In the end, there was no one willing to die for it in sufficient numbers to matter, because the thing being defended had never been sufficiently real or sufficiently worth defending to the people being asked to defend it. The American ambassador in Saigon, Graham Martin, refused to believe the situation was as bad as it was until almost the last possible moment, refusing to order the evacuation that would have given more time to more people on the grounds that ordering an evacuation would trigger the panic it was intended to manage. By the time the evacuation was ordered, on the 29th of April 1975, the situation was beyond management. The helicopters flew through the night from the embassy roof and from other collection points around the city, shuttling people to ships offshore, and the queues of people desperate to leave were longer than any helicopter fleet could service, and the decisions about who could be lifted out and who would have to be left behind were made in the chaos of a situation that no planning had adequately anticipated. The South Vietnamese, who had worked most closely with the Americans, the interpreters and the intelligence contacts and the government officials and the military officers, whose names were on lists that the North Vietnamese would eventually find, had the most to lose from the collapse and the fewest options for escape. Many of them had been promised evacuation and found themselves left behind when the helicopters stopped coming, a betrayal that many of them would carry for the rest of their lives. Some of them spending years in re-education camps and then decades more in the overseas Vietnamese communities of America and Australia and France, where the diaspora of the war eventually settled. The boat that left Saigon and other southern cities in the weeks and months after the fall carried hundreds of thousands of people who had chosen the risk of the South China Sea in a small boat over the certainty of life under the new government. And the stories of those voyages, of the boats that arrived and the boats that did not, constitute a separate chapter in the war's long human ledger, that extended well beyond the fall of the city and the final defeat. On the morning of the 30th of April, the last American helicopter lifted off the embassy roof, carrying the last Americans and the last South Vietnamese who could fit on it, and the North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon a few hours later. A soldier climbed out of the lead tank and ran up the steps of the presidential palace and tore down the South Vietnamese flag and raised the flag of the Provisional Revolutionary Government, and the war was over, in the specific sense that the shooting had stopped and the Americans had left and the government they had sustained for 20 years had ceased to exist. The final image of American involvement in Vietnam is not a military formation or a victory parade or a signed surrender. The images that had marked the ends of previous American wars and that provided the visual grammar through which those wars had been understood and absorbed into memory. It is a machine in the air above a city, a helicopter on a rooftop, a queue of people who know they are being left. The particular image of an ending that is not a conclusion but a departure, something that stops rather than resolves, leaving behind questions that no amount of subsequent analysis has fully answered. The war is over, in the specific sense that the shooting has stopped and the Americans have left. It is not over in any other sense that matters. The helicopter has lifted off. The war is over in every administrative and military sense, and what remains is the longer reckoning, the one that does not end when the shooting stops, but continues through the years of aftermath and memory and slow accounting, through the decades in which the people who were changed by the war try to understand what changed them and whether it can be undone. We can come back now to the place where this story began, to the delta before dawn, to the paddies and the tree line and the air that sits warm and damp and patient on everything it touches, and let the story settle into the landscape that outlasted it. The paddies are still there, the ones below the tree line, the ones where the darkness sits in the water just before the sun arrives. And if you stood in them now, you would smell the same wet earth and wood smoke that has been in this soil since long before any of the names that the 20th century attached to it. What the land has absorbed and what it has not is a question that takes longer than a human lifetime to answer. The dead are the first fact of the aftermath, and they number in a way that resists comprehension. Roughly 3 million Vietnamese people died in the American phase of the war, a figure that encompasses North and South and civilian and military and the various gradations between those categories that a guerrilla war produces, and that does not include the dead of the French phase or the dead of the Japanese occupation or the dead of the subsequent conflicts in Cambodia and Laos that were downs, extreme consequences of the same struggle. 3 million people in a country of roughly 40 million at the time, a proportion that is difficult to translate into any familiar human scale. The kind of loss that reshapes a population and leaves traces that persist through generations in the form of missing fathers and uncles and brothers, of villages with too many women and too few men, of a demographic gap that takes decades to fill and had the feeling of does not quite undo. The American dead numbered more than 58,000, each one a person with a name and a family and a particular history that ended in a particular place, in the jungle or the delta or the highlands or the hospital ship offshore. The families they left behind carried the specific grief of a loss sustained in a war that many Americans were not certain was worth the cost. A grief compounded by the absence of the communal mourning that previous wars had made possible, the absence of the clear, shared purpose that allowed a nation to grieve together and find in the grief some meaning. Many of the veterans who came home found themselves unable to explain what they had experienced to people who had not been there, and found the country unwilling or unable to provide the context in which the experience could be held and understood, and found themselves alone with it in ways that produced damage that took many of them years or decades to begin to address, and took some of them rely. The landscape of Vietnam itself carries the war's physical marks in ways that the passage of decades has softened but not erased. The craters from the bombing have become ponds in many areas, utilized by the farmers who work around them as fish ponds, which is a kind of ingenious Vietnamese pragmatism that converts the war's destruction into something useful. The forests that were defoliated have regrown partially in the decades since, though the regrowth is not the same as the original forest, and the ecologists who study it describe a changed and simplified ecosystem in the areas most heavily sprayed. The soil in those areas still carries traces of the chemicals at depths that agricultural practice continues to disturb, and the rates of certain illnesses in the most heavily sprayed regions remain elevated in ways that epidemiologists continue to study. The war ended in 1975. The war's effects on the land did not end in 1970. The boat people came in waves across the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fleeing the new government's policies and the re-education camps and the collectivization of agriculture and the general transformation of a society that had been one thing for 20 years into something very different. They came in fishing boats and small craft across the South China Sea, facing pirates and storms and the indifference of ships that passed them without stopping. And they arrived in refugee camps in Malaysia and Hong Kong and the Philippines, and eventually in the communities of the Vietnamese diaspora that formed in America and France and Australia and Canada and wherever else the international refugee system sent them. The diaspora they formed became one of the most consequential long-term consequences of the war. A community of Vietnamese outside Vietnam that maintained its own relationship to the country and its history, and that has, over the subsequent decades, developed a complex and evolving connection to the homeland that the war separated it from. The American veterans who came home and made their lives around what they had seen and done in Vietnam became, in the decades after the war, the subjects of a long and uneven national reckoning. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, designed by Maya Lin and opened in 1982, was itself the product of a political argument about what the war had meant and how it should be remembered. And the war that resulted, black granite cut into the earth of the National Mall, was at first controversial and then was slowly understood to be exactly right, exactly what the war required in its memorial, not a monument to victory or to mission accomplished, but a surface for grief, a place where loss could be acknowledged without being redeemed, where the names could be read without a story being imposed on them. Veterans who had avoided talking about the war began to visit it and to find in standing before the names something they had not been able to find elsewhere. The wall asked nothing of them except to remember. That turned out to be enough. Vietnam today is a country that has made its peace with its own history and with the United States in ways that would have seemed impossible in the years immediately following the war. American tourists walk through the tunnels of Ho Chi and the War Museum in Ho Chi Minh City, which is what the city that was Saigon is now called. The museum's exhibits include the photographs of American photographers, including the photographs that define how the war was understood in America. Displayed now in a building in a city in a country that won the war and can afford the magnanimity of displaying the enemy's art. The United States and Vietnam normalized diplomatic relations in 1995, and the relationship has deepened steadily since, partly for strategic reasons and partly because the populations of both countries have found that the thing they share is more complex and more interesting than the simple opposition that the war created. There is something in the current state of the relationship between the two countries that it is worth sitting with for a moment, not as a lesson or a resolution, but simply as a fact worth noticing. The country that spent 20 years and more than $500 billion and the lives of more than 58,000 of its soldiers trying to prevent a communist government from ruling Vietnam, now trades with that government, maintains an embassy in Hanoi, and sends its tourists to walk the streets of Ho Chi Minh City and eat pho and visit the War Museum and ride motorbikes through the Clear Delta. The Vietnamese government that fought the Americans for a decade and absorbed everything that a military deploying 500,000 soldiers and more bomb tonnage than the entire Pacific campaign of the Second World War could deliver has made peace with the country that delivered it, and the peace is real, and the trade is growing, and the people of both countries interact with a warmth and a curiosity that the war from the inside would have made impossible to imagine. History does not resolve things neatly, but sometimes it produces outcomes that are stranger and more generous than the people inside the conflict can see coming. Ho Chi Minh died in 1969, 6 years before the victory he had spent his life working toward, and was mourned by a country that understood that his absence from the final act was a loss of a particular kind. Gott lived until 2013, long enough to see the country he had defended become a member of international organizations and a destination for American tourists, and an economy growing fast enough to lift millions of people out of the poverty that the war had deepened. He was, by all accounts, not a man who spoke much about the war in his final years. There was perhaps nothing left to say. The tree line is still there, dark against the lightning sky. The water in the paddies holds the last of the night. Something moves at the edge of the field, or seems to move. The air smells of earth and wood smoke. The country continues, as it always has, as it always will. The names are still there. You can find them on a long black wall in Washington. More than 58,000 of them, each one a person who arrived in a country they had mostly never heard of before. Their orders came and did not come back. The wall is designed so that when you stand close enough to read a name, you can see your own face reflected in the stone behind it. That detail was deliberate. The architect understood something about what a memorial is supposed to do. The tunnels are still there. The ones at Ho Chi have been widened slightly for tourists so that people of average size can crawl through them and feel, for 30 seconds, something approximate to what the men and women who lived in them felt for years. There are gift shops. There are guides who explain the history in careful English. The tourists emerge, blinking into the light, brushing the red earth from their knees, and then they go and have lunch, which is the correct response because life continues, because life has always continued here, with a patience that outlasts everything that has been brought against it. The delta is still there, long and green and threaded with water. The same geography that made this country worth taking and impossible to hold. The rice paddies flat and silver in the early light. The tree lines dark along their edges, the air sitting warm and damp on everything it touches. Somewhere in the distance, a motor scooter. Somewhere, a radio. Somewhere, the smell of something cooking that has been cooking in this part of the world since before France, before America, before any of the names the outside world attached to this place. The country continues. It has always continued. The geological patience that defeated every army that came here is not a military strategy. It is simply a quality of the place and the people in it, and a particular relationship between a land and the people who belong to it that no amount of firepower has ever been able to sever. Thank you for spending this evening here, moving through one of the 20th century's longest and most instructive shadows. If this kind of company is what you come here for at night, subscribing to the channel means the next story will be waiting for you when you are ready. There is always another century, another long and difficult and necessary thing worth sitting with in the dark. Sleep well.